Every nation you can name carries debt, not just a little, but mountains of it. The United States is buried under tens of trillions. Japan sits on its own enormous pile. Add up every government, business, and household on the planet, and the total debt is so large it dwarfs the entire world economy. But here's where things get strange: if all of us owe money, who's the one collecting? The answer isn't a single country, or a secret billionaire, or some hidden vault of gold. When you trace the ownership of the world's debt, you eventually run into a circular loop. The world owes money to itself, yet the structure of that loop didn't happen by accident. Across 3 centuries, 4 powerful financiers introduced ideas that quietly rewired how nations borrow. Their innovations created a world where government debt never really goes away, where interest payments never stop, and where the system constantly channels wealth upward. Not because of rumors or conspiracy theories, but because these changes were debated in public, written into law, and preserved in contracts that still exist today. Understanding how they did it explains why today's numbers, 38 trillion, 100 trillion, 300 trillion, aren't glitches in the system. They are the system. Let's start at the beginning. For most of history, rulers borrowed money the old-fashioned way. A king needed cash, so he went to wealthy merchants or noble families. They lent the money, hoped he'd pay it back, and sometimes he didn't. When a king defaulted, the lenders took the loss and moved on. Debt cleared, and the slate reset. That all changed because of a Scottish merchant named William Paterson. By the 1690s, England was fighting an expensive war with France, and King William III was out of options. Tax revenue wasn't enough. Traditional lenders were refusing to help. England had a reputation for not paying its debts, and no one wanted to take the risk again. Paterson walked in with a radical proposal. He promised he could gather a group of wealthy backers willing to lend a huge sum, the kind of money the country needed to survive the war. But this loan came with a twist: England would never pay it back. Only the interest. Forever. To administer this perpetual loan, Paterson proposed creating a new institution, a powerful financial body that would manage the debt, issue notes backed by the lender's gold, and act as the Crown's permanent funding machine. That institution became the Bank of England. And with it, the modern age of government debt, endless, rolling, self-reinforcing, began. Once Paterson's plan was accepted, the machine began to hum. Wealthy backers handed their gold to the new Bank of England, the bank turned around and loaned that value to the government, and the government promised something astonishingly simple: steady interest payments, funded by taxes, for as long as the nation existed. No repayment of the original loan. Ever. To the merchants, this wasn't charity. It was a dream investment. Parliament guaranteed the interest. The government had the legal power to raise taxes to make those payments. And the paper notes the merchants received in exchange for their gold weren't just receipts, they could be traded. They circulated like money, except better, because they generated income. So in 1694, Parliament gave the green light. The Bank of England opened its doors. England got the cash it desperately needed for war, and a new idea was born: national debt as a permanent institution. Not something to fix, something to maintain. What the public rarely hears is how brilliantly this arrangement worked for the financiers. The government paid 8% a year on the original loan. That meant a fixed stream of income, year after year, century after century, as long as the country kept functioning. The merchants didn't just lend money, they bought a lifetime revenue stream, backed by every taxpayer in England. If one of them wanted out, no problem. They could sell their claim to someone else. The debt lived on, even if the owner changed. But Paterson's real breakthrough wasn't the loan. It was the power he gave the bank afterward. The Bank of England was allowed to issue paper notes tied directly to the government's debt. In other words, the government's promise to pay interest could be turned into new money. Debt became currency. And the more the government borrowed, the more the bank could create. That formula became the foundation of modern finance: governments borrow. They never erased the principle. They pay interest indefinitely. And the IOUs become part of the money supply. For bankers, this was elegant. For ordinary people paying the taxes that funded it, it was a never-ending bill. Within a generation, the idea spread everywhere. France built its own version. The Dutch refined theirs. And when the United States was born, Alexander Hamilton, inspired directly by Britain's model, designed America's financial system around the same engine: permanent debt, tradable bonds, interest paid from taxes. Paterson himself didn't die rich. He passed away in 1719 without the fortune you'd expect from someone who reshaped the global economy. But the mechanism he helped create never went away. The Bank of England still stands. And more than 3 centuries later, Britain's national debt has never been fully cleared. It's been renewed, expanded, restructured, but not eliminated. Because the system was never designed for the debt to vanish. It was designed for the payments to continue. By the time the 18th century faded into the 19th, governments had fully embraced borrowing. Wars, roads, armies, even day-to-day expenses were funded with loans. But the process was messy. Each deal was negotiated separately, interest rates swung wildly, and only a small circle of elite lenders could participate. Then came Nathan Rothschild. The man who turned government debt from a scattered cottage industry into a powerful financial machine. The Rothschilds began as traders in Frankfurt. But by the early 1800s, the 5 brothers had planted themselves in the key financial capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and their home city. No one else had anything like this network. They could move money with unheard of speed. They could pass information across borders before governments could. Nathan, running the London branch, became the mastermind. During the Napoleonic Wars, he helped fund Britain's military efforts, but it was the method that changed everything. Instead of acting like a traditional lender, Nathan did something new. He bought government bonds at a discount, fronted the cash immediately, then resold those bonds to investors for a profit. He didn't just finance governments. He built a market for government debt. Investors got a tradable asset. Governments got fast money. And Nathan earned the spread. But his advantage didn't stop at clever deal-making, it extended to something even more powerful: information. In 1815, when the Battle of Waterloo decided the fate of Europe, Nathan Rothschild learned the result before anyone in London. His courier network outran official government messengers. Knowing Britain had won, Nathan made a calculated move. He quietly sold British bonds, triggering panic among investors who assumed the worst. Prices collapsed. And when fear peaked, he bought massive amounts of those same bonds at fire sale prices. When the real news hit, Britain victorious, the value of those bonds soared. Nathan walked away with a fortune not because he cheated the system, but because he understood it better than everyone else. This became the Rothschild blueprint: own the information. Control the distribution. Shape the market. And it worked. By the 1820s, if a European government needed money, they inevitably found themselves negotiating with the Rothschilds. Not because of intimidation, but because the Rothschild family had become the gateway to the investor world. They had the network. They had the trust. They dictated the terms. And this is where the debt trap deepened. In earlier centuries, rulers could default. It was messy and embarrassing, but financially survivable. Creditors took the loss, and life went on. But once government bonds began circulating across countries, once a French investor could own British debt, or a German bank could hold Austrian bonds, something new happened: default didn't just hurt one lender. It threatened the entire financial web. A single missed payment could topple banks, bankrupt families, and shake multiple economies at once. Debt became too interconnected to fail. The choice to default effectively disappeared. From that point forward, governments had to keep paying. And because the debt never shrank, they had to keep borrowing just to stay afloat. The trap wasn't just permanent, it became locked shut. The Rothschild fortune reached its peak in the mid-1800s. For a time, they were wealthier than any royal family. Their wealth didn't come from factories, inventions, or grand estates. It came from interest streams tied to the indebtedness of nations. Paterson had invented the idea of permanent public debt. Rothschild turned it into a global industry. And by the dawn of the 20th century, one major country still hadn't modernized its system, the United States. Its banks operated independently, money was chained to gold, and there was no central authority to stabilize or coordinate the financial system. That would soon change, because an American titan named J.P. Morgan was about to step onto the stage. J.P. Morgan is often remembered as the man who steadied America during a crisis, but he wasn't doing it out of charity. He was protecting the financial world he controlled. In 1907, panic swept through the markets. Stocks crashed. Banks shut their doors. The entire economy felt like it was sliding off a cliff. With Washington paralyzed, Morgan stepped in. He summoned New York's biggest bankers to his private library, locked them inside, and refused to let anyone leave until they agreed to put up their own money to rescue the system. It worked. The collapse stopped. Morgan became the unofficial central banker of the United States. But Morgan was old, and he knew he couldn't personally rescue the system the next time it fell apart. So he and the country's most powerful financiers pushed for something permanent, a central bank. The problem was that the American public despised central banks. Twice in the country's early history they'd been shut down as symbols of elite control. So Morgan's circle hid their intentions behind a different design. In 1910, a small group of senators, bankers, and Morgan's closest allies slipped away to a private island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. Behind closed doors, over 9 quiet days, they drafted the blueprint for a new monetary system. No reporters. No public debate. No political oversight. They kept it secret because they understood exactly how it would look, bankers writing the rules for America's money. The plan they created was brilliant in how it disguised its true power. Don't call it a central bank, call it a Federal Reserve System. Don't build one institution, build 12 regional banks. Don't make it look like Wall Street runs it, give it a public board appointed by the president. On paper, it appeared decentralized and democratic. In practice, control stayed in the hands of private bankers. Member banks owned the regional Federal Reserve banks. Those regional banks chose key positions in the system. And the most important branch, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the engine that could create money and buy government debt, sat under the influence of the biggest Wall Street institutions. Morgan's institutions. When Congress approved the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, many lawmakers didn't grasp its full implications. But the financiers did. Because the moment the Fed was created, the debt system transformed. Before the Federal Reserve existed, government borrowing had a natural limit. Banks only had so much to lend. But the Fed could create new money simply by buying government bonds. It didn't need deposits. It didn't need gold. It could expand the money supply with a pen stroke. Here's how the cycle worked. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. The government spends the money. And taxpayers cover the interest forever. No ceiling. No natural stopping point. A pipeline of endless demand for government debt. Once that mechanism was in place, debt no longer needed to shrink. It could roll forward indefinitely, because the buyer, the Federal Reserve, would always be there. The interest payments ultimately flowed from taxpayers to the private banks that owned the Federal Reserve System. The structure guaranteed it. Morgan died the same year the Federal Reserve came into being. But the design he championed, the quiet, polished architecture built in back rooms and private islands, became the backbone of America's modern financial system. It's the reason today's soaring debt isn't an accident or a failure. It's simply the machine functioning the way its creators intended. With the Federal Reserve now guaranteeing demand for U.S. bonds, the old limits on government borrowing simply vanished. As long as the Fed stood ready to buy, there was always someone willing to hold the debt. The trap that had started in 1694 was now bottomless. By the 1970s, permanent debt had become normal across the developed world. Rich nations borrowed endlessly and refinanced endlessly. But poorer nations were still playing by older rules. They took out loans to build roads, dams, power grids, real infrastructure, and many genuinely tried to pay those loans back. Then came the moment that locked the modern world into permanent indebtedness, the Volcker era. Paul Volcker became chair of the Federal Reserve in 1979, and he walked into a mess. Inflation was raging above 10%. The dollar was losing credibility. Other countries no longer trusted America's currency. Volcker had to act, and he was willing to break the economy to save the currency. So he did something unprecedented. He slammed interest rates upward. The primary rate doubled. Then doubled again. At one point it hit 20%, the highest in U.S. history. Inflation collapsed. But another crisis burst open. During the 1970s, developing nations had borrowed massive sums in dollars while rates were low. Now those same countries faced interest payments that had suddenly tripled. Mexico owed around $80 billion. Brazil and Argentina tens of billions more. And their export earnings simply couldn't cover the payments. In 1982, Mexico finally said what many others were quietly thinking. We can't pay. Under older financial systems, this would have been a clean, if painful, reset. Creditors would take losses, governments would regroup, and the global system would move on. But that wasn't possible anymore. American banks had lent out most of that money. A default by Mexico, or Brazil, or Argentina would have dragged down the biggest banks in the U.S., Citibank, Chase, Bank of America. The entire financial system could have snapped. Volcker had a choice: let the banks eat their losses and allow the system to clear, or build another layer onto the debt trap. He chose the second option. Working through the International Monetary Fund, Volcker and U.S. officials arranged enormous rescue loans, not to help the countries recover, but to help them keep paying the American banks. These structural adjustment loans came with a brutal price: government budgets slashed, state assets sold off, currencies devalued, markets opened to foreign-controlled, economic policy handed over to outside supervisors. Countries kept their lights on, but they lost control of their own economic direction. And the loans didn't reduce the debt. They simply kept the interest payments flowing. That was Volcker's contribution to the system: when a country can't pay, don't forgive the debt. Extend it. Reshape it. Stretch it out. Turn temporary insolvency into permanent dependence. The trap was no longer just deep, it was global. You can see the same pattern play out again and again: Argentina in 2001. Greece in 2010. Sri Lanka in 2022. And dozens of nations in between. The script never changes: a country falls behind, IMF steps in, austerity imposed, assets sold, sovereignty traded away, debt remains. Volcker passed away in 2019, but the system he cemented is still running today. Even when nations hit the wall, even when there's no realistic chance they will ever pay off their balance, default is off the table. They are refinanced into a kind of eternal repayment schedule. And the interest keeps flowing upward to the same financial institutions that sit atop the system. When you put the four architects together, the picture becomes clear. Paterson created the idea: governments borrow forever and only pay interest. Rothschild expanded it: debt becomes global and impossible to default on. Morgan institutionalized it: central banks ensure unlimited demand for government bonds. Volcker locked it worldwide: even unpayable debt must survive through restructuring. That is how we arrive at today's reality: more than $315 trillion owed across governments, companies, and households. Not $1 of it designed to be cleared. Every dollar built to generate interest. And the system continues exactly as it was engineered to. The modern financial world runs on a simple truth most people never hear: every dollar of government debt is someone else's asset. And because of that, the system can't stop. It can't slow down. It can't be paid off. It only grows. Take the United States. Washington has issued roughly $38 trillion in debt. That number sounds impossible, but here's what it really means. About half of those bonds sit in the hands of everyday Americans, through pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve. These institutions buy government debt because it's considered the safest thing on earth. And in return, they receive a steady stream of interest payments, around $1 trillion a year. Where does that money come from? Taxes. So you have a loop: workers send money to the government passes it along to the holders of its debt, and those holders are, overwhelmingly, large institutions and wealthy investors. It's a quiet, automatic transfer of wealth upward, built directly into the system. The other half of U.S. debt is technically owed to the government itself, Social Security, Medicare, and other trust funds. But that's just accounting smoke. When those programs need their money back, taxpayers have to supply it. One pocket paying another pocket, and both pockets are yours. Now widen the lens. Japan runs the same system. Europe runs the same system. China runs its own version. Every major economy borrows endlessly, rolls over old debt, pays interest, and never closes the books. And because these countries also hold each other's bonds, Japan holds U.S. treasuries, Europe holds emerging market debt, the U.S. has exposure to Europe through the IMF, it forms a giant circle. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest keeps flowing upward into the same global financial institutions. Here's the catch: if governments ever tried to pay off their debt, the entire money supply would shrink. Hard. Because the money we use is created when governments borrow. Remove the debt, remove the dollars. That would trigger a crash so deep it would make the Great Depression look like a mild slowdown. So the debt can't go away. Not in the U.S., not anywhere. It has to keep growing. And who benefits from a world where governments can't stop borrowing? The asset managers who hold the bonds: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. They manage tens of trillions in other people's savings. They buy government bonds, collect the interest, layer new financial products on top of them, and charge fees on everything that moves. It's the biggest, most reliable business model in human history. Trillions in debt, generating trillions in interest, flowing through institutions that never vote, never stand for office, but quietly shape the choices of every nation on earth. This didn't happen overnight. 3 centuries of decisions built this machinery. Paterson, in the 1600s, proved governments could borrow forever and simply pay interest. Rothschild turned national debt into an international market. Morgan helped create central banks that could manufacture money to support government borrowing. And Volcker, in the 1980s, locked developing nations into permanent debt cycles, not by forgiving their loans, but by restructuring them again and again so the interest never stopped. These men never met. They never planned anything together. But each solved a financial crisis in a way that pushed the world further into a system where debt is constant, interest is eternal, and the people managing the debt hold the real power. That's why $38 trillion isn't considered a crisis. It's the product. It's the engine. And it's the reason escape is impossible without wrecking the entire global economy. If this gives you a new understanding of how government debt really works, and why the system looks chaotic on the surface but strangely stable underneath, stick around. Because once you see how the machine was built, the world finally starts to make sense.